Little House in the Big Woods by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Chapter 1. Little House in the Big Woods. Once upon a time, 60 years ago, a little girl lived in the big woods of Wisconsin in a little gray house made of logs. The great dark trees of the big woods stood all around the house, and beyond them were other trees, and beyond them were more trees. As far as a man could go to the north in a day or a week or a whole month, there was nothing but woods. There were no houses. There were no roads. There were no people. There were only trees and wild animals who had their homes among them. Wolves lived in the big woods, and bears, and huge wild cats. Muskrats and mink and otter lived by the streams. Foxes had dens in the hills, and deer roamed everywhere. To the east of the little log house, and to the west, there were miles upon miles of trees, and only a few little log houses scattered far apart in the edge of the big woods. So far as the little girl could see, there was only the one little house where she lived with her father and mother, her sister Mary, and baby sister Carrie. A wagon track ran before the house, turning and twisting out of sight in the woods where the wild animals lived, but the little girl did not know where it went, nor what might be at the end of it. The little girl was named Laura, and she called her father Pa and her mother Ma. In those days and in that place, children did not say father and mother, nor mama and papa as they do now. At night when Laura lay awake in the trundle bed, she listened and could not hear anything at all but the sound of the trees whispering together. Sometimes far away in the night a wolf howled. Then he came nearer and howled again. It was a scary sound. Laura knew that wolves would eat little girls, but she was safe inside the solid log walls. Her father's gun hung over the door, and good old Jack, the brindle bulldog, lay on guard before it. Her father would say, "Go to sleep, Laura. Jack won't let the wolves in." So Laura snuggled under the covers of the trundle bed close beside Mary and went to sleep. One night her father picked her up out of bed and carried her to the window so that she might see the wolves. There were two of them, sitting in front of the house. They looked like shaggy dogs. They pointed their noses at the big bright moon and howled. Jack paced up and down before the door, growling. The hair stood up along his back, and he showed his sharp, fierce teeth to the wolves. They howled, but they could not get in. The house was a comfortable house. Upstairs there was a large attic, pleasant to play in when the rain drummed on the roof. Downstairs was the small bedroom and the big room. The bedroom had a window that closed with a wooden shutter. The big room had two windows with glass in the panes, and it had two doors, a front door and a back door. All around the house was a crooked rail fence to keep the bears and the deer away. In the yard in front of the house were two beautiful big oak trees. Every morning as soon as she was awake, Laura ran to look out of the window, and one morning she saw in each of the big trees a dead deer hanging from a branch. Pa had shot the deer the day before, and Laura had been asleep when he brought them home at night and hung them high in the trees so the wolves could not get the meat. That day, Pa and Ma and Laura and Mary had fresh venison for dinner. It was so good that Laura wished they could eat it all, but most of the meat must be salted and smoked and packed away to be eaten in the winter. For winter was coming, the days were shorter, and frost crawled up the window panes at night. Soon the snow would come. Then the log house would be almost buried in snowdrifts, and the lake and the streams would freeze. In the bitter cold weather, Pa could not be sure of finding any wild game to shoot for meat. The bears would be hidden away in their dens where they slept soundly all winter long. The squirrels would be curled in their nests in hollow trees, with their furry tails wrapped snugly around their noses. The deer and the rabbits would be shy and swift. Even if Pa could get a deer, it would be poor and thin, not fat and plump as deer are in the fall. Pa might hunt alone all day in the bitter cold in the big woods covered with snow, and come home at night with nothing for Ma and Mary and Laura to eat. As much food as possible must be stored away in the little house before winter came. Pa skinned the deer carefully and salted and stretched the hides, for he would make soft leather of them. Then he cut up the meat and sprinkled salt over the pieces as he laid them on a board. Standing on the end in the yard was a tall length cut from the trunk of a big hollow tree. Pa had driven nails inside it as far as he could reach from each end. Then he stood it up, put a little roof over the top, and cut a little door on one side near the bottom. On the piece that he cut out, he fastened leather hinges. Then he fitted it into place, and that was the little door with the bark still on it. After the deer meat had been salted several days, Pa cut a hole near the end of each piece and put a string through it. Laura watched him do this, and then she watched him hang the meat on the nails in the hollow log. He reached up through the little door and hung meat on the nails as far up as he could reach. Then he put a ladder against the log, climbed up to the top, moved the roof to one side, and reached down inside to hang meat on those nails. Then Pa put the roof back again, climbed down the ladder, and said to Laura, "Run over to the chopping block and fetch me some of those green hickory chips, new clean white ones." So Laura ran to the block where Pa chopped wood and filled her apron with the fresh, sweet-smelling chips. Just inside the little door in the hollow log, Pa built a fire of tiny bits of bark and moss, and he laid some of the chips on it very carefully. Instead of burning quickly, the green chips smoldered and filled the hollow log with thick, choking smoke. Pa shut the door, and a little smoke squeezed through the crack around it, and a little smoke came out through the roof, but most of it was shut in with the meat. "There's nothing better than good hickory smoke," Pa said. "That will make good venison that will keep anywhere, in any weather." Then he took his gun, and slinging his axe on his shoulder, he went away to the clearing to cut down some more trees. Laura and Ma watched the fire for several days. When the smoke stopped coming through the cracks, Laura would bring more hickory chips, and Ma would put them on the fire under the meat. All the time there was a little smell of smoke in the yard, and when the door was opened, a thick, smoky, meaty smell came out. At last Pa said the venison had smoked long enough. Then they let the fire go out, and Pa took all the strips and pieces of meat out of the hollow tree. Ma wrapped each piece neatly in paper and hung them in the attic, where they would keep safe and dry. One morning Pa went away before daylight with the horses and wagon, and that night he came home with a wagon load of fish. The big wagon box was piled full, and some of the fish were as big as Laura. Pa had gone to Lake Pepin and caught them all with a net. Ma cut large slices of flaky white fish without one bone for Laura and Mary. They all feasted on the good fresh fish. All they did not eat fresh was salted down in barrels for the winter. Pa owned a pig. It ran wild in the big woods, living on acorns and nuts and roots. Now he caught it and put it in a pen made of logs to fatten. He would butcher it as soon as the weather was cold enough to keep the pork frozen. Once, in the middle of the night, Laura woke up and heard the pig squealing. Pa jumped out of bed, snatched his gun from the wall, and ran outdoors. Then Laura heard the gun go off, once, twice. When Pa came back, he told what had happened. He had seen a big black bear standing beside the pig pen. The bear was reaching into the pen to grab the pig, and the pig was running and squealing. Pa saw this in the bright starlight, and he fired quickly, but the light was dim, and in his haste he missed the bear. The bear ran away into the woods, not hurt at all. Laura was sorry Pa did not get the bear. She liked bear meat so much. Pa was sorry too, but he said, "Anyway, I saved the bacon. The garden behind the little house had been growing all summer. It was so near the house that the deer did not jump the fence and eat the vegetables in the daytime. And at night, Jack kept them away. Sometimes in the morning there were little hoof prints among the carrots and the cabbages, but Jack's tracks were there too, and the deer had jumped right out again. Now the potatoes and carrots, the beets and turnips and cabbages were gathered and stored in the cellar, for freezing nights had come. Onions were made into long ropes, braided together by their tops, and then were hung in the attic beside wreaths of red peppers strung on threads. The pumpkins and the squashes were piled in orange and yellow and green heaps in the attic's corners. The barrels of salted fish were in the pantry, and yellow cheeses were stacked on the pantry shelves. Then one day, Uncle Henry came riding out of the big woods. He had come to help Pa butcher. Ma's big butcher knife was already sharpened, and Uncle Henry had brought Aunt Polly's butcher knife. Near the pig pen, Pa and Uncle Henry built a bonfire and heated a great kettle of water over it. When the water was boiling, they went to kill the hog. Then Laura ran and hid her head on the bed and stopped her ears with her fingers so she could not hear the hog squeal. "It doesn't hurt him, Laura," Pa said. "We do it so quickly." But she did not want to hear him squeal. In a minute she took one finger cautiously out of an ear and listened. The hog had stopped squealing. After that, butchering time was great fun. It was such a busy day, with so much to see and do. Uncle Henry and Pa were jolly, and there would be spare ribs for dinner. And Pa had promised Laura and Mary the bladder and the pig's tail. As soon as the hog was dead, Pa and Uncle Henry lifted it up and down in the boiling water until it was well scalded. Then they laid it on a board and scraped it with their knives, and all the bristles came off. After that they hung the hog in a tree, took out the insides, and left it hanging to cool. When it was cool, they took it down and cut it up. There were hams and shoulders, side meat and spare ribs and belly. There was the heart and the liver and the tongue and the head to be made into head cheese, and the dishpan full of bits to be made into sausage. The meat was laid on a board in the back door shed, and every piece was sprinkled with salt. The hams and the shoulders were put to pickle in brine, for they would be smoked, like the venison, in the hollow log. "You can't beat hickory-cured ham," Pa said. He was blowing up the bladder. It made a little white balloon, and he tied the end tight with a string and gave it to Mary and Laura to play with. They could throw it in the air and spat it back and forth with their hands, or it would bounce along the ground and they could kick it. But even better fun than the balloon was the pig's tail. Pa skinned it for them carefully, and into the large end he thrust a sharpened stick. Ma opened the front of the cook stove and raked hot coals out onto the iron hearth. Then Laura and Mary took turns holding the pig's tail over the coals. It sizzled and fried, and drops of fat dripped off it and blazed on the coals. Ma sprinkled it with salt. Their hands and their faces got very hot, and Laura burned her finger, but she was so excited she did not care. Roasting the pig's tail was such fun that it was hard to play fair, taking turns. At last it was done. It was nicely browned all over, and how good it smelled. They carried it into the yard to cool it, and even before it was cool enough, they began tasting it and burned their tongues. They ate every little bit of meat off the bones, and then they gave the bones to Jack, and that was the end of the pig's tail. There would not be another one till next year. Uncle Henry went home after dinner, and Pa went away to his work in the big woods. But for Laura and Mary and Ma, butchering time had only begun. There was a great deal for Ma to do, and Laura and Mary helped her. All that day and the next, Ma was trying out the lard in big iron pots on the cook stove. Laura and Mary carried wood and watched the fire. It must be hot, but not too hot, or the lard would burn. The big pots simmered and boiled, but they must not smoke. From time to time, Ma skimmed out the brown cracklings. She put them in a cloth and squeezed out every bit of the lard, and then she put the cracklings away. She would use them to flavor Johnny cake later. Cracklings were very good to eat, but Laura and Mary could only have a taste. They were too rich for little girls, Ma said. Ma scraped and cleaned the head carefully, and then she boiled it till all the meat fell off the bones. She chopped the meat fine with her chopping knife in the wooden bowl, and she seasoned it with pepper and salt and spices. Then she mixed the pot liquor with it and set it away in a pan to cool. When it was cool, it would cut into slices, and that was the head cheese. The little pieces of meat, lean and fat, that had been cut off the large pieces, Ma chopped and chopped until it was all chopped fine. She seasoned it with salt and pepper and with dried sage leaves from the garden. Then with her hands she tossed and turned it until it was well mixed, and she molded it into balls. She put the balls in a pan out in the shed where they would freeze and be good to eat all winter. That was the sausage. When butchering time was over, there were the sausages and the head cheese, the big jars of lard, and the keg of white salt pork out in the shed, and in the attic hung the smoked hams and the shoulders. The little house was fairly bursting with good food stored away for the long winter. The pantry and the shed and the cellar were full, and so was the attic. Laura and Mary must play in the house now, for it was cold outdoors, and the brown leaves were all falling from the trees. The fire in the cook stove never went out. At night, Pa banked it with ashes to keep the coals alive till morning. The attic was a lovely place to play. The large round colored pumpkins made beautiful chairs and tables. The red peppers and the onions dangled overhead. The hams and the venison hung in their paper wrappings, and all the bunches of dried herbs, the spicy herbs for cooking and the bitter herbs for medicine, gave the place a dusty, spicy smell. Often the wind howled outside with a cold, lonesome sound. But in the attic, Laura and Mary played house with the squashes and the pumpkins, and everything was snug and cozy. Mary was bigger than Laura, and she had a rag doll named Nettie. Laura had only a corn cob wrapped in a handkerchief, but it was a good doll. It was named Susan. It wasn't Susan's fault that she was only a corn cob. Sometimes Mary let Laura hold Nettie, but she did it only when Susan couldn't see. The best times of all were at night. After supper, Pa brought his traps in from the shed to grease them by the fire. He rubbed them bright and greased the hinges of the jaws and the springs of the pans with feather dipped in bear's grease. There were small traps and middle-sized traps, and great bear traps with teeth in their jaws that Pa said would break a man's leg if they shut on it. While he greased the traps, Pa told Laura and Mary little jokes and stories, and afterward he would play his fiddle. The doors and the windows were tightly shut, and the cracks of the window frames stuffed with cloth to keep out the cold. But Black Susan, the cat, came and went as she pleased, day and night, through the swinging door of the cat hole in the bottom of the front door. She always went very quickly, so the door would not catch her tail when it fell shut behind her. One night when Pa was greasing the traps, he watched Black Susan come in, and he said, "There was once a man who had 2 cats, a big cat and a little cat." Laura and Mary ran to lean on his knees and hear the rest. "He had 2 cats, Pa repeated, a big cat and a little cat. So he made a big cat hole in his door for the big cat, and then he made a little cat hole for the little cat." There Pa stopped. "But why wouldn't the little cat?" Mary began. "Because the big cat wouldn't let it," Laura interrupted. "Laura, that is very rude. You must never interrupt," said Pa. "But I see," he said, "that one of you has more sense than the man who cut the 2 cat holes in his door." Then he laid away the traps, and he took his fiddle out of its box and began to play. That was the best time of all.
Chapter 2. Winter Days and Winter Nights. The first big snow came, and the bitter cold. Every morning Pa took his gun and his traps and was gone all day in the big woods, setting the small traps for muskrats and mink along the creeks. the middle-sized traps for foxes and wolves in the woods. He set out the big bear traps, hoping to get a fat bear before they all went into their dens for the winter. One morning, he came back, took the horses and sled, and hurried away again. He had shot a bear. Laura and Mary jumped down and clapped their hands. They were so glad. Mary shouted, I want the drumstick! I want the drumstick! Mary did not know how big a bear's drumstick is. When Pa came back, he had both a bear and a pig in the wagon. He had been going through the woods with a big bear trap in his hands and a gun on his shoulder when he walked around a big pine tree covered in snow, and the bear was behind the tree. The bear had just killed the pig and was picking it up to eat it. Pa said the bear was standing up on its hind legs, holding the pig in its paws just as though they were hands. Pa shot the bear, and there was no way of knowing where the pig came from nor whose pig it was. So I just brought home the bacon, Pa said. There was plenty of fresh meat to last for a long time. The days and nights were so cold that the pork in the box and the bear meat hanging in the little shed outside the back door were solidly frozen and did not thaw. When Ma wanted fresh meat for dinner, Pa took the axe and cut off a hunk of frozen bear meat or pork, but the sausage balls or the salt pork or the smoked hams and the venison Ma could get for herself from the shed or the attic. The snow kept coming until it drifted against and banked against the house. In the mornings, the window panes were covered with frost and beautiful pictures of trees and flowers and fairies. Ma said that Jack Frost came in the night and made pictures while everyone was asleep. Laura thought Jack Frost was just a little man in a snowy white, wearing a glittery white pointed cap and soft white knee boots made out of deerskin. His coat was white and his mittens were white, and he did not carry a gun on his back, but in his hands he had shining, sharp tools with which he carved the pictures. Laura and Mary were allowed to take Ma's thimble and made pretty patterns of circles in the frost on the glass. But they never spoiled the pictures that Jack Frost had made in the night. When they put their mouths close to the pane and blew with their breath on it, the white frost melted and ran in drips down the glass. Then they would see drifts of snow outdoors and great trees standing bare and black, making thin blue shadows on the white snow. Laura and Mary helped Ma with the work. Every morning there were dishes to wipe. Mary wiped more of them than Laura because she was bigger, but Laura always wiped more carefully, her own little cup and plate. But by the time the dishes were all wiped and set away, the trundle bed was aired. Then standing, one on each side, Laura and Mary straightened the covers, tucked them in well at the foot and the sides, plumped up the pillows, and put them in place. Then Ma pushed the trundle bed into its place under the big bed. After this was done, Ma began the work that belonged to that day. Each day had its own proper work. Ma used to say, wash on Monday, iron on Tuesday, mend on Wednesday, churn on Thursday, clean on Friday, bake on Saturday, and rest on Sunday. Laura liked the churning and the baking days best of all in the week. In the winter, the cream was not yellow as it was in the summer, and the butter churned from it was white and not so pretty. Ma liked everything on her table to be pretty, so in the wintertime she colored the butter. After she had put the cream in a tall crockery churn and set it near the stove to warm, she washed and scraped a long orange-colored carrot. Then she grated it on the bottom of the old leaky tin pan that Pa had punched full of nail holes for her. Ma rubbed the carrot across the roughness until she had rubbed it all through the holes, and when she lifted up the pan, there was a soft, juicy mound of grated carrot. She put this in a little pan of milk on the stove, and when the milk was hot, she poured the milk and the carrot into a cloth bag. Then she squeezed the bright yellow milk into the churn, where it colored all the cream. Now the butter would be yellow. Laura and Mary were allowed to eat the carrot after the milk had been squeezed out. Mary thought she ought to have the larger share because she was older, and Laura said she should have it because she was littler. But Ma said they should divide it evenly. It was very good. When the cream was ready, Ma scalded the long wooden churn dash and put it in the churn, and dropped the wooden churn cover over it. The churn cover had a little round hole in the middle, and Ma moved the dash up and down through the hole. She churned for a long time. Mary could sometimes churn while Ma rested, but the dash was too heavy for Laura. At first, splashes of cream showed thick and smooth around the little hole, and after a long time they began to look grainy. Then Ma churned more slowly, and on the dash there began to appear tiny grains of yellow butter. Then Ma took off the churn cover, and there was butter in a golden lump drowning in the buttermilk. When Ma took out the lump with a wooden paddle into a wooden bowl, and then she washed it many times in cold water, turning it over and over, and working it with a paddle until the water ran clear. After that, she salted it. Now came the best part of churning. Ma molded the butter. On the loose bottom of the wooden butter mold was carved the picture of a strawberry with 2 strawberry leaves. With the paddle, Ma packed the butter tightly into the mold until it was full. Then she turned it upside down over a plate and pushed the handful of the loose to the bottom. Pushed on the handle of the loose bottom. This little firm pat of golden butter came out, with strawberry in its leaves molded at the top. Laura and Mary watched, breathless, one on each side of Ma, while the little golden butter pats, each with its strawberry on top, dropped onto the plate. As Ma put all the butter through the mold, then Ma gave them each a drink of good, fresh buttermilk. On Saturdays, when Ma made the bread, they each had a little piece of dough to make into a little loaf. They might have a bit of cookie dough, too, to make little cookies, and once Laura even made a pie with her patty pan. After the day's work was done, Ma sometimes cut paper dolls for them. She cut the dolls out of stiff white paper and drew the faces on with pencil. Then from the bits of colored paper she cut dresses and hats, ribbons and laces, so that Laura and Mary could dress their dolls beautifully. But the rest of the time was all at night, when Pa came home. He would come in from his tramping through the snowy woods with tiny icicles hanging from the end of his mustache, and he would hang up his gun on the wall over the door, throw off his fur coat and mittens, and call, "Where's my little half-pint and sweet cider half drunk up?" That was Laura, because she was so small. Laura and Mary would run and climb up onto his knees and sit there while he warmed himself by the fire. Then he would put on his coat and cap and mittens again and go out and do the chores and bring in plenty of wood for the fire. Sometimes, when Pa had walked his trap lines quickly because the traps were empty, or when he had got home some game sooner than usual, he would come home early. Then he would have time to play with Laura and Mary. One game they loved was called Mad Dog. Pa would run his fingers through his thick brown hair, standing it up all on end. Then he dropped onto all fours, growling, and chased Laura and Mary all around the room, trying to get them cornered where they couldn't get away. They were quick at dodging and running, but once he caught them against the wood box or behind the stove, they couldn't get past Pa. There was no other way out. Then Pa growled so terribly, his hair was wild and his eyes so fierce that it all seemed real. Mary was so frightened that she would not move, but as Pa came nearer, Laura screamed, and with a wild leap and a scramble she went over the woodbox, dragging Mary with her. At once there was no Mad Dog at all. There was only Pa standing there with his blue eyes shining, looking at Laura. "Well," he said to her, "you're only a little half-pint of cider half drunk up, but by jinks, you're as strong as a little French horse." "You shouldn't frighten the children so, Charles," Ma said. "Look how big their eyes are." Pa looked, and then he took down his fiddle and began to play and sing. Yankee Doodle went to town, he wore his striped trousies, he swore he couldn't see the town, there were so many houses. Laura and Mary forgot all about the Mad Dog. And there he saw some great big guns, big as a log of maple. Every time they turned them round, it took 2 yoke of cattle. And every time they fired 'em off, took a horn of powder. It made a noise like father's gun, only a nation louder. Pa was keeping time with his foot, and Laura clapped her hands to the music when he sang. And I'll sing Yankee Doodle Dee Doo, I'll sing Yankee Doodle, I'll sing Yankee Doodle Dee Doo, and I'll sing Yankee Doodle. All alone in the big woods in the snow and the cold, the little log house was warm and snug and cozy. Pa and Ma, Mary and Laura, and baby Carrie were comfortable and happy there, especially at night, when the fire was shining on the hearth, and the cold and the dark and the wild beasts were all shut out, and Jack the brindle bulldog and Black Susan the cat lay blinking at the flames in the fireplace. Ma sat in her rocking chair, sewing by the light of the lamp on the table. The lamp was bright and shiny. There was salt in the bottom of this glass bowl with the kerosene, to keep the kerosene from exploding, and there were bits of red flannel among the salt to make it pretty. It was pretty. Laura loved to look at the lamp, with its glass chimney so clean and sparkling, its yellow flame burning so steadily, and its bowl of clear kerosene colored by red bits of flannel. She loved to look at the fire in the fireplace, flickering and changing all the time, burning yellow and red and sometimes green above the logs, and hovering over the golden and ruby coals. And then Pa told stories. When Laura and Mary begged him for a story, he would take them down on his knees and tickle their faces with his long whiskers until they laughed aloud. His eyes were blue and merry. One night, Pa looked at Black Susan stretching herself before the fire and running her claws out and in, and he said, "Do you know that a panther is a cat? A great big wild cat?" "No," said Laura. "Well, it is," said Pa. "Just imagine Black Susan, bigger than Jack and fiercer than Jack when he growls. Then she would be just like a panther." He settled Laura and Mary more comfortably on his knees, and he said, "I'll tell you about Grandpa and the panther." "Your grandpa?" Laura asked. "No, Laura, your grandpa, my father." "Oh," Laura said, and she wiggled closer against Pa's arm. She knew her grandpa. He lived far away in the big woods, in a big log house. Pa began. The story of Grandpa and the panther. Your grandpa went to town one day and was late starting home. It was dark when he came riding his horse through the big woods, so dark that he could hardly see the road. And when he heard a panther scream, he was frightened, for he had no gun. "How does a panther scream?" Laura asked. "Like a woman," said Pa, "like this." Then he screamed so that Laura and Mary shivered with terror. Ma jumped in her chair and said, "Mercy, Charles!" But Laura and Mary loved to be scared like that. The horse, with Grandpa on him, ran so fast, for it was frightened too. But it could not get away from the panther. The panther followed through the dark woods. It was a hungry panther, and it came up as fast as the horse could run. It screamed now on his side of the road, and now on the other side, and it was always close behind. Grandpa leaned forward in the saddle and urged the horse to run faster. The horse was running as fast as it could possibly run, and still the panther screamed close behind. Then Grandpa caught a glimpse of it, as it leaped from treetop to treetop, almost overhead. It was a huge black panther leaping through the canopy. It was in the air like Black Susan leaping on a mouse. It was so many, many times bigger than Black Susan. It was so big that if it leaped on Grandpa, it could kill him with its enormous slashing claws and its long, sharp teeth. Grandpa on his horse was running away from it just as a mouse runs from a cat. The panther did not scream anymore. Grandpa did not see it anymore, but he knew that it was coming, leaping after him in the dark woods behind him. The horse ran with all its might. At last the horse ran up on Grandpa's house. Grandpa saw the panther springing. Grandpa jumped off the horse against the door. He burst through the door and slammed it behind him. The panther landed on the horse's back, just where Grandpa had been. The horse screamed terribly and ran. He was running away into the big woods with the panther riding on his back, ripping his back with its claws. But Grandpa grabbed his gun from the wall and got to the window just in time to shoot the panther dead. Grandpa said he would never again go into the big woods without his gun. When Pa told this story, Laura and Mary shivered and snuggled closer to him. They were safe and snug on his knees with his strong arms around him. They liked to be there before the warm fire with Black Susan purring on the hearth, and with Dog Jack stretched out beside her. But when they heard a wolf howl, Jack's head lifted, and the hairs rose stiff along his back. But Laura and Mary listened to that lonely sound in the dark, and in the cold of the big woods, they were not afraid. They were cozy and comfortable in their house made of logs, with the snow drifted around it, and the wind crying because it had not yet get in by the fire.
Chapter 3. The Long Rifle. Every evening before he began to tell stories, Pa made the bullets for his next day's hunting. Laura and Mary helped him. They brought the big, long-handled spoon and the box full of bits of lead and the bullet mold. Then, while he squatted on the hearth and made the bullets. They sat on each side of him and watched. First, he melted the bits of lead into this big spoon held in the coals. When the lead was melted, he poured it carefully from the spoon into the little hole in the bullet mold. He waited a minute. Then he opened the mold, and out dropped a bright new bullet onto the hearth. The bullet was too hot to touch, but it shone so temptingly that sometimes Laura or Mary could not help touching it. Then they burned their fingers, but they did not say anything, because Pa had told them never to touch a new bullet. If they burned their fingers, that was their own fault. They should have minded him. So they put their fingers in their mouths to cool them and watched Pa make more bullets. There would be a shining pile of them on the hearth before Pa stopped. He let them cool, then with his jacket knife he trimmed off the little lumps left by the hole in the mold. He gathered up the tiny shavings of lead and saved them carefully, to melt again the next time he made bullets. The finished bullets he put into his bullet pouch. This was a little bag which Ma had made beautifully of buckskin, from a buck Pa had shot. After the bullets were made, Pa would take his gun down from the wall and clean it. Out in the snowy woods all day, it might have gathered a little dampness, and the inside of the barrel was sure to be dirty from powder smoke. So Pa would take the ramrod from its place under the gun barrel and fasten a piece of clean cloth on its end. He stood the butt of the gun in the pan on the hearth and poured boiling water from the tea kettle into the gun barrel. Then he dropped the ramrod in and rubbed it up and down, while the hot water blackened with powder smoke spurted out through the little hole on which the cap was placed when the gun was loaded. Pa kept morning in more water and washing the gun barrel with the cloth on the ramrod until the water ran out clear. Then the gun was clean. The water must always be boiling, so that the heated steel would dry instantly. Then Pa put a clean, greased rag on the ramrod, and while the gun barrel was still hot, he greased it well on the inside. With another clean, greased cloth he rubbed it all over, outside, until every bit of it was oiled and sleek. After that, he rubbed and polished the gun stock until the wood of it was bright and shining, too. Now he was ready to load the gun again, and Laura and Mary must help him. Standing straight and tall, holding the long gun upright on its butt, while Laura and Mary stood on either side of him, Pa said, "You watch me now, and tell me if I make a mistake." So they watched very carefully. But he never made a mistake. Laura handed him the smooth, polished cow horn full of gunpowder. The top of the horn was a little metal cap. Pa filled this cap full of the gunpowder and poured the powder down the barrel of the gun. Then he shook the gun a little and tapped the barrel to be sure that all the powder was together in the bottom. "Where's my patch box?" he asked them. And Mary gave him the little tin box full of little pieces of greased cloth. Pa laid one of these bits of greasy cloth over the muzzled gun. We pause for a picture. Depicted is baby Mary and baby Laura, helping Pa with his gun cleaning. Pa put one of the shiny new bullets on it, and with the ramrod he pushed the bullet and the cloth down the gun barrel. Then he pounded them tightly against the powder. When he hit them with the ramrod, the powder bounced up in the gun barrel, and Pa caught it and thrust it down again. He did this for a long time. Next, he put the ramrod back in its place against the gun barrel. Then, taking a box of caps from his pocket, he raised the hammer of the gun and slipped one of the little bright caps over the hollow pin that was under the hammer. We pause now for a picture depicting the gun cleaning supplies, including pots, bullets, ladles, and kettles. He let the hammer down, slowly and carefully. If it came down quickly, bang! The gun would go off. Now the gun was loaded, and Pa laid it on its hooks over the door. When Pa was at home, the gun always lay across those two wooden hooks above the door. Pa had whittled the hooks out of a green stick with his knife, and had driven their straight ends deep into the holes in the log. The hooked ends curved upward and held the gun securely. The gun was always loaded and always above the door so that Pa could get it quickly and easily anytime he needed a gun. When Pa went into the big woods He always made sure that the bullet pouch was full of bullets and that the tin patch box and the box of caps were with it in his pockets. The powder horn and a small sharp hatchet hung at his belt, and he carried the gun ready loaded on his shoulder. He always reloaded the gun as soon as he had fired it, for, he said, he did not want to meet trouble with an empty gun. Whenever he shot at a wild animal, he had to stop and load the gun, measure the powder, put it in and shake it down, put in the patch and the bullet and pound them down, and then put a fresh cap under the hammer before he could shoot again. When he shot at a bear or a panther, he must kill it with the first shot. A wounded bear or panther could kill a man before he had time to load his gun again. But Laura and Mary were never afraid when Pa went alone into the big woods. They knew he could always kill bears and panthers with the first shot. After the bullets were made and the gun was loaded, came storytelling time. "Tell us about the voice in the woods," Laura would beg him. Pa crinkled up his eyes at her. "Oh, no," he said. "You don't want to hear about the time I was a naughty little boy." "Oh, yes, we do, Laura and Mary said. So Pa began. The story of Pa and the voice in the woods. "When I was a little boy, not much bigger than Mary, I had to go every afternoon to find the cows in the woods and drive them home. My father told me never to play by the way, but to hurry and bring the cows home before dark, because there were bears and wolves and panthers in the woods. One day, I was started earlier than usual, so I thought I did not need to hurry. There were so many things to see in the woods that I forgot that dark was coming. There were red squirrels in the trees, chipmunks scurrying through the leaves, and little rabbits playing games together in the open places. Little rabbits, you know, always have games together before they go to bed. I began to play. I was a mighty hunter, stalking the wild animals and the Indians. I played I was fighting the Native Americans, until the woods seemed full of wild men, and then all at once I heard the birds twittering good night. It was dusky in the path and dark in the woods. I knew that I must get the cows home quickly, or it would be black night before they were safe in the barn, and I couldn't find the cows. I listened, but I could not hear the bells. I called, but the cows did not come. I was afraid of the dark and the wild beasts, but I dared not go home to my father without the cows, so I ran through the woods, hunting and calling. All the time the shadows were getting thicker and darker, and the woods seemed larger, and the trees and the bushes looked strange. I could not find the cows anywhere. I climbed up hills looking for them and calling, and I went down into dark ravines, calling and looking. I stopped and listened for the cowbells, and there was not a sound but the rustling of leaves. Then I heard loud breathing and thought a panther was there, in the dark behind me. But it was only my own breathing. My bare legs were scratched by the briars, and when I ran through the bushes, their branches struck me. But I kept on, looking and calling. "Suki! Suki! Suki! Suki!" I shouted with all my might. "Suki!" Right over my head something asked, "Who?" My hair stood straight on end. "Who? Who?" the voice said again. And then, how I did run. I forgot all about the cows. All I wanted was to get out of the dark woods, to get home. That thing in the dark came after me and called again, "Who?" I ran with all my might. I ran till I couldn't breathe, and still I kept on running. Something grabbed my foot, and down I went. Up I jumped, then I ran. Not even a wolf could have caught me. At last I came out of the dark woods by the barn. There stood all the cows, waiting to be let through the bars. I let them in, then ran to my house. My father looked me up and down and said, "Young man, what makes you so late? Been playing by the way?" I looked down at my feet. Then I said that one big toenail that had been torn clean off. I had been so scared that I had not felt it hurt till that minute. Pa always stopped telling the story here and waited until Laura said. Pause for a depiction of small Pa running through the woods. Until Laura said, "Go on, Pa. Please go on." "Well," Pa said, "then your grandpa went out into the yard and cut out a stout switch, and he came back into the house and gave me a good talking to. so that I would remember to mind him after that. A big boy 9 years old is old enough to remember to mind, he said. There's a good reason for what I tell you to do, he said. And if you will do as you are told, no harm will come to you. Yes, yes, Pa, Laura would say, bouncing up and down on Pa's knee. And then what did he say? He said, if you obeyed me as you should, you wouldn't have been out in the big woods after dark, and you wouldn't have been scared by a screech owl. This concludes Chapter 3.
Chapter 4. Christmas. Christmas was coming. The little log house was almost buried in snow. Great drifts were banked against the walls and windows, and in the morning when Pa opened the door, there was a wall of snow as high as Laura's head. Pa took the shovel and shoveled it away, and then he shoveled a path to the barn, where the horses and cows were snug and warm in their stalls. The days were clear and bright. Laura and Mary stood on chairs by the window and looked out across the glittering snow at the glittering trees. The snow was piled up all along the bare, dark branches, and it sparkled the sunshine. Icicles hung from the eaves of the house to the snowbanks, great icicles as large as the top of Laura's arm. They were like glass and full of sharp lights. Pa's breath hung in the air like smoke. When he came along the path from the barn, he breathed it out in the clouds and froze in white frost on his mustache and beard. When he came in, stamping the snow from his boots, and caught Laura up in a bear's hug against his cold, big coat, his mustache was beaded with little drops of melting frost. Every night when he was busy, working on a large piece of board and 2 small pieces, he whittled them with his knife. He rubbed them with sandpaper and with the palm of his hand, until Laura touched them and felt soft and smooth as silk. Then, with his sharp jackknife, he worked at them, cutting the edges of the large one into little peaks and towers, with large stars carved on the very tallest point. He cut little holes through the wood. He cut the holes in shapes of windows and little stars and crescent moons, in circles. All around them he carved tiny leaves and flowers and birds. One of the little boards he shaped in a lovely curve, and around its edges he carved leaves and flowers and stars, and thought he cut a crescent moon in circles. Around the edges of the smallest board he carved a tiny flowering vine. He made the tiniest shavings, cutting very slowly and carefully, making whatever he thought would be pretty. At last he had the pieces finished, and in one night he fitted them together. When this was done, the large piece was beautifully carved back for a smooth little shelf across its middle. The large star was at the very top of it. The curved piece supported the shelf underneath, and it was carved beautifully too, and the little vine ran around the edge of the shelf. Pa had made this bracket for a Christmas present for Ma. He hung it carefully against the long wall between the windows. And Ma stood her little china woman on the shelf. The little china woman had a china bonnet on her head, and china curls hung against her china neck. Her china dress was laced in front, and she wore a pale pink china apron and the little glint china shoes. She was beautiful, standing on the shelf with flowers and leaves and birds and moons carved all around her, and the large star at the very top. Ma was busy all day, cooking good things for Christmas. She baked salt-rising bread and bread and Swedish crackers and a huge pan of baked beans with salt pork and molasses. She baked vinegar pies and dried apple pies and filled a big jar with cookies, and she let Laura and Mary lick the cake spoon. One morning she boiled molasses and sugar together until they made a thick syrup, and Pa brought 2 pans of clean white snow from outdoors. Laura and Mary each had a pan, and Pa and Ma showed them how to pour dark syrup in little streams onto the snow. They made circles and squishly things, and these hardened once they were candy. Laura and Mary might eat 1 piece each, but the rest was saved for Christmas Day. All this was done because Aunt Eliza and Uncle Peter and the cousins, Peter and Alice, and Ella were coming to spend Christmas. The day before Christmas they came. Laura and Mary had the gay ringing of sleigh bells, growing louder every moment, and then the big bobsled came out of the woods and drove up to the gate. Aunt Eliza and Uncle Peter and the cousins were in it, all covered up under blankets and robes and buffalo skins. They were wrapped up in so many coats and mufflers and veils and shawls that they looked like big, shapeless bundles. When they all came in, the little house was full and running over. Black Susan ran out and hid in the barn, but Jack leaped in circles through the snow, barking as though he would never stop. Now there were cousins to play with. As soon as Aunt Eliza had wrapped them, Peter and Alice and Ella and Laura and Mary began to run and shout. At last Aunt Eliza told them to be quiet. Then Alice said, "I'll tell you what let's do. Let's make pictures." Alice said they must go outdoors to do it, and Ma thought it was too cold for Laura to play outdoors. But when she saw how disappointed Laura was, she said she might go after all, for a little while. She put on Laura's coat and mittens and warm cape with the hood and wrapped the muffler around her neck and let her go. Laura had never had so much fun. All morning she played outdoors in the snow with Alice and Ella and Peter and Mary, making pictures. The way they did it was this. Each one by herself climbed up on a stump, and then all of them at once, holding their arms out well, they fell off the stumps into the soft, deep snow. They fell flat on their faces, and they tried to get up without spoiling the marks they'd made when they fell. If they did it well, there in the snow were 5 holes shaped almost exactly like the little girls and boys, arms and legs and all. They called these their pictures. They played so hard all day that when night came they were too excited to sleep. But they must sleep, or Santa Claus would not come. So they hung their stockings by the fireplace, and they said their prayers and went to bed. Alice and Ella and Mary and Laura all in one big bed on the floor. Peter had the trundle bed. Aunt Eliza and Uncle Peter were going to sleep in the big bed, and another bed was made in the attic floor for Pa and Ma. The buffalo robes and all the blankets had been brought in from Uncle Peter's sled, and so there were enough covers for everybody. Pa and Ma and Aunt Eliza and Uncle Peter sat by the fire, and just as Laura was drifting asleep, she heard Uncle Peter say, "Eliza had a narrow squeak the other day when I was away at Lake City. You know Prince and that big dog of mine?" Laura was wide awake at once. She almost liked to hear about dogs. She lay still as a mouse and looked at the firelight flickering on the log walls, listened to Uncle Peter. "Well," Uncle Peter said, "early in the morning Eliza started to the spring to get a pail of water, and Prince was following her. She got to the edge of the ravine where the path goes down to the spring, and all of a sudden Prince set his teeth in the back of her skirt and pulled. You know what a big dog he is. Eliza scolded him, but he wouldn't let go, and he's so big and strong she couldn't get away from him. He kept backing and pulling till he tore a piece out of his skirt. It was my blueprint," Aunt Eliza said to Ma. "Dear me," Ma said. "He tore a big piece right out of the back of it," Aunt Eliza said. "I was so mad I could have whipped him for it, but he growled at me." "Prince growled at you?" said Pa. "Yes," said Aunt Eliza. "So then she started again toward the spring," Uncle Peter went on, "but Prince jumped in the path ahead of her and snarled at her. He paid no attention to her talking and scolding. He just kept on showing his teeth and snarling, and when she tried to get past him, he kept it in front of her and snapped at her. That scared her." "I should think it would," said Mom. "He was so savage I thought he was going to bite me," Aunt Eliza said. "I believe he would have." "I've never heard of such a thing," said Ma. "What on earth did you do?" "I turned right around and ran into the house where the children were and slammed the door," Aunt Eliza answered. "Of course Peter was savage with strangers," said Uncle Peter. "But also maybe Prince was. But he was always so kind to Eliza and the children, and I felt perfectly safe with them. Eliza couldn't understand it at all. After she got into the house, he kept pacing around it and growling. Every time she started to open the door, he jumped at her and snarled." "Had he gone mad?" said Ma. "That's what I thought," said Aunt Eliza. "I didn't know what to do. There I was, shut up in the house with children and not daring to go out, and we didn't have any water. I couldn't get any snow to melt. Every time I opened the door so much as a crack, Prince acted like he would tear me to pieces. "How long did this go on?" Pa asked. "All day, till late in the afternoon," said Aunt Eliza. "Peter had taken the gun, or I would have shot him." Along late in the afternoon, Uncle Peter said, he got quiet and lay down in front of the door. Eliza thought he was asleep, and she made up her mind to try and slip past him to get to the spring for some water. So she opened the door very quietly, but of course he woke up right away. When he saw she had the water pail in her hand, he got up and walked ahead of her to the spring, just the same as usual, and there, all around the spring in the snow, were fresh tracks of a panther. "The tracks were as big as my hand," said Aunt Eliza. "Yes," Uncle Peter said. "He was a big fellow. His tracks were bigger, the biggest I've ever seen. He would have gotten Eliza, sure, if Prince had let her go to the spring that morning. I saw the tracks. He had been lying up in that big oak over the spring, waiting for some animal to come there for water. Undoubtedly, he would have dropped down on her." Night was coming on when she saw the tracks, and she didn't waste any time getting back to the house with her pail of water. Prince followed close behind, looking back to the ravine now and then. "I took him to the house with me," Aunt Eliza said, "and we all stayed inside till Peter came home." "Did you get him, Pa?" asked Uncle Peter. "No," Uncle Peter said. "I took my gun and hunted round the place, but I could find him. I saw some more of his tracks. He'd gone on north, farther in the big woods." Alice and Ella and Mary were all wide awake now. Laura put her head under the covers and whispered to Alice, "My, weren't you scared?" Alice whispered back that she was scared, but Ella was scareder. Ella whispered that she wasn't, either. Any such thing. "Well, anyway, you made more fuss about being thirsty," Alice whispered. They lay there whispering about it until Ma said, "Charles, those children will never go to sleep unless you play for them." So Pa got out his fiddle. The room was still and warm and full of firelight. Ma and Aunt Eliza and Uncle Peter's were big and quivering on the walls in the flickering of the firelight, and Pa's fiddle sang merrily to itself. It sang Money Musk and the Red Heifer, The Devil's Dream, and Arkansas Traveler. And Laura went to sleep while Paul and the fiddle were both softly singing, "My darling Nellie Gray, they have taken you away, and I'll never see my darling any more." In the morning, they all woken up at the same moment. They looked in their stockings, and something was in them. Santa Claus had been there. Alice and Laura in their red flannel nightgowns, and Peter in his red flannel nightshirt, all ran shouting to see what he had brought. In each stocking there was a pair of bright red mittens, and there was long flat stick of red and white striped peppermint candy, all the beautifully notched along each side. And they were all so happy they could hardly speak at first. They just looked on with shining eyes at the lovely Christmas presents. But Laura was the happiest of all. Laura had a rag doll. She was a beautiful doll. She had a face of white cloth with the black button eyes. A pencil had made her eyebrows, and her cheeks and her mouth were red with the ink made from pokeberries. Her hair was black yarn that had been knit and ravelled, so that it was curly. She had red little flannel stockings and little black gaiters for shoes. And her dress was pretty pink and blue calico. She was so beautiful that Laura could not say a word. She just held her tight and forgot everything else. She did not know that everyone was looking at her until Aunt Eliza said, "Did you ever see such big eyes?" The other girls were not jealous because Laura had mittens and candy and a doll, because Laura was the littlest girl, except baby Carrie and Aunt Eliza's little baby, Dolly Verdon. The babies were too small for dolls. They were so small that they didn't even know about Santa Claus. They just put their fingers in their mouths and ring because of all of the excitement. Laura sat down on the edge of the bed and held her doll. She loved her red mittens and she loved the candy, but she loved her doll best of all. She named her Charlotte. Then they all looked at each other's mittens and tried on their own, and Peter bit a large piece out of his stick candy, but Alice and Ella and Mary and Laura licked theirs to make it last longer. "Well, well," Uncle Peter said, "isn't there even one stocking with nothing but a switch in it? My, you all have been such good children." But they didn't believe that Santa Claus could really have given any of them nothing but a switch. That happened to some children, but it couldn't happen to them. It was so hard to be good all the time, every day, for a whole year. You mustn't tease the children, Peter, Aunt Eliza said. Ma said, Laura, aren't you going to let the other girls hold your dolls? She meant little girls must not be selfish. So Laura let Mary take the beautiful doll, and then Alice held her a minute, and then Ella. They smoothed the pretty dress, admired the red flannel stockings and the gaiters, and the curly woven hair. But Laura was glad at last when Charlotte was safe in her arms again. Pa and Uncle Peter had each a pair of new warm mittens, knit in little squares of red and white, and Ma and Aunt Eliza made them. Aunt Eliza had brought Ma a large red apple stock full of cloves. How good it smelled! And it would not spoil, for many cloves would keep it sound and sweet. Ma gave Aunt Eliza a little needlebook she had made, with bits of silk for covers and soft white flannel leaves into which to stick the needles. The flannel would keep the needles from rusting. They all admired Ma's beautiful bracket, and Aunt Eliza said that Uncle Peter had made one for her, of course, with different carving. Santa Claus had not given them anything at all. Santa Claus did not give grown people presents, but that was not because they had not been good. Pa and Ma were good. It was because they were grown-ups, and grown-up people must give each other presents. Then all the presents must be laid away for a little while. Peter went out with Uncle and Pa to do the chores, and Alice and Ella helped Aunt Eliza make the beds, and Laura and Mary set the table, while Ma got breakfast. For breakfast there were pancakes, and Ma made pancakes mans for each one of the children. Ma called each one in turn to her plate, and each could stay by the stove and watch, while with a spoonful of batter Ma put the arms and legs and the head on the pancake. It was exciting to watch her turn the little man over, quickly and carefully, and on a hot griddle. When it was done, she put the smoking hot plate on the plate. Peter ate the head off his man right away, but Alice and Ella and Mary and Laura ate theirs slowly, in little bits, first the arms, then the legs, and then the middle, saving the head for last. Today the weather was so cold that they could not play outdoors, but there were new mittens to admire and candy to lick, and they all sat on the floor together and looked at the pictures at the Bible, the pictures of all kinds of animals and birds in Pa's big green book. Laura kept Charlotte in her arms the whole time. Then there was Christmas dinner. Alice and Ella and Peter and Mary and Laura did not say a word at the table, for they all knew that children should be seen and not heard. But they did not ask for second helpings. Ma and Aunt Eliza kept plates full and let them eat all the good things they could hold. Christmas comes but once a year, said Aunt Eliza. Dinner was early, because Aunt Eliza, Uncle Peter, and the cousins had such a long way to go. Best the horses can do, Uncle Peter. We'll hardly make it home before dark. So as soon as they had eaten dinner, Uncle Peter and Pa went to put the horses to the sled, while Ma and Aunt Eliza wrapped up the cousins. They pulled heavy woolen stockings and woolen shoes they were already wearing, and they put mittens and coats on warm hoods and shawls, and wrapped mufflers around their necks and thick woolen veils over their faces. Ma slipped piping hot baked potatoes into their pockets to keep their fingers warm, and Aunt Eliza flat irons were hot, and Aunt Eliza's flat irons were hot on the stove, ready to put their feet in the sled. The blankets and quilts of the buffalo robes were warm too. So they all got into the big bobbly sled, cozy and warm, and Pa took the last robe in around them. Goodbye, goodbye, they called. Off they went, the horses trotting gaily, it's the sleigh bells ringing. In just a little while the merry sound of bells was gone, and Christmas was over. But what a happy Christmas it had been.
Chapter 5. Sundays. Now the winter seemed long. Laura and Mary began to be tired of staying always in the house. Especially on Sundays, the time went so slowly. Every Sunday, Mary and Laura were dressed from the skin out in their best clothes, with fresh ribbons in their hair. They were very clean because they had their baths on Saturday night. In the summer, they were bathed in water from the spring, but in the wintertime, Pa filled and heaped the washtub full of clean snow, and on the cook stove it melted to water. Then, close by the warm stove, behind a screen made of a blanket, over 2 chairs, Ma bathed Laura, then she bathed Mary. Laura was bathed first because she was littler than Mary. She had to go to bed early on Saturday nights with Charlotte, because after she was bathed and put into her clean nightgown, Pa must empty the washtub and fill it with snow again for Mary's bath. Then after Mary came to bed, Ma had her bath behind the blanket, and then Pa had his, and they were all clean for Sunday. On Sundays, Mary and Laura must not run or shout or be noisy in their play. Mary could not sew on her 9-patch quilt, and Laura could not knit on the tiny mittens she was making for baby Carrie. They might look quietly at their paper dolls, but they must not make anything new for them. They were not allowed to sew on doll clothes, not even with pins. They must sit quietly and listen while Ma read Bible stories to them, or stories about lions and tigers and white bears from Pa's big green book, The Wonders of the Animal World. They might look at pictures, and they might hold their rag dolls nicely and talk to them, but there was nothing else they could do. Laura liked best to look at the pictures in the big Bible with its paper covers. Best of all was the picture of Adam naming the animals. Adam sat on a rock, and all the animals and birds, big and little, were gathered around him, anxiously waiting to be told what kind of animals they were. Adam looked so comfortable. He did not have to be careful to keep his clothes clean because he had no clothes on. He wore only a skin around his middle. "Did Adam have good clothes to wear on Sundays?" Laura asked Ma. "No," Ma said. "Poor Adam, all he had to wear was skins." Laura did not pity Adam. She wished she had nothing to wear but skins. On Sunday, after supper, she could not bear it any longer. One Sunday after supper, she could not bear it any longer. She began to play with Jack, and in a few minutes she was running and shouting. Pa told her to sit in her chair and be quiet, but when Laura sat down, she began to cry and kick the chair with her heels. "I hate Sunday," she said. Pa put down his book. "Laura," he said sternly, "come here." Her feet dragged as she went because she knew she deserved a spanking, but when she reached Pa, he looked at her sorrowfully for a moment, then took her on his knee and cuddled her against him. He held out his other arm to Mary and said, "I am going to tell you a story about when Grandpa was a boy." The story of Grandpa's sled and the pig. When your grandpa was a boy, Laura, Sunday did not begin on Sunday morning as it does now. It began at sundown on Saturday night, when everyone stopped every kind of work or play. Supper was solemn. After supper, Grandpa's father read aloud a chapter of the Bible while everyone sat straight and still in his chair. Then they all knelt down with their father and said a long prayer. When he said, "Amen," they got up from their knees and each took a candle and went to bed. They must go straight to bed with no playing, laughing, or even talking. Sunday morning they ate a cold breakfast because nothing could be cooked on Sunday. Then they all dressed in their best clothes and walked to church. They walked because hitching up the horses was work, and no work could be done on Sunday. They must walk slowly and solemnly, looking straight ahead. They must not joke or laugh or even smile. Grandpa and his 2 brothers walked ahead, and their father and mother walked behind them. In church, Grandpa and his brothers must sit perfectly still for 2 long hours and listen to the sermon. They dared not fidget on the hard bench. They dared not swing their feet. They dared not turn their heads to look at the windows or the walls or the ceilings of the church. They must sit perfectly motionless and never for one instant take their eyes from the preacher. When church was over, they walked slowly home. They might walk on the way, but they could not talk loudly. They must never laugh or smile. At home, they ate a cold dinner which had been cooked the day before. Then, all the long afternoon, they must sit in a row on a bench and study their catechism until at last the sun went down and Sunday was over. Now, Grandpa's home was about halfway down the side of a steep hill. The road went from the top of the hill to the bottom, right past the front door, and in the winter it was the best place for sliding downhill that you could possibly imagine. One week, Grandpa and his two brothers, James and George, were making a new sled. They worked at it every minute of their playtime. It was the best sled they had ever made, and it was so long that all three of them could sit on it, one behind the other. They planned to finish it in time to sled downhill Saturday afternoon. For every Saturday afternoon they had 2 or 3 hours to play. But that week their father was cutting down trees in the big woods. He was working hard, and he kept the boys working with him. They did all the morning chores by lantern light and were hard at work in the woods when the sun came up. They worked till dark, and then there were chores to do, and after supper they had to go to bed so that they could get up early in the morning. And they had no time to work on the sled until Saturday afternoon. Then they worked at it just as fast as they could, but they didn't get it finished till just as the sun went down Saturday night. After the sun went down, they could not slide downhill, not even once. That would be breaking the Sabbath. So they put the sled in the shed behind the house to wait until Sunday was over. All the 2 long hours in church next day, they kept their feet still and their eyes on the preacher. They were thinking about the sled. At home, while they ate dinner, they couldn't think of anything else. After dinner, their father sat down to read the Bible, and Grandpa and James and George sat still as mice on their bench with their catechism. But they were thinking about the sled. The sun shone brightly, and the snow was smooth and glittering on the road. They could see it through the window. It was a perfect day for sliding downhill. They looked at their catechism and thought about the new sled, and it seemed that Sunday would never end. After a long time, they heard a snore. They looked at their father, and they saw that his head had fallen back against the chair, and he was fast asleep. Then James looked at George, and James got up from the bench and tiptoed out of the room through the back door. George looked at Grandpa, and George tiptoed after James, and Grandpa looked fearfully at their father, but on tiptoe he followed George and left their father snoring. They took their new sled and went quietly up to the top of the hill. They meant to slide down just once, then they would put the sled away and slip back to their bench and catechism just before their father woke up. James sat in the front of the sled, then George, and then Grandpa, because he was the littlest. The sled started, at first slowly, then faster and faster. It was running, flying down the long, steep hill. But the boys dared not shout. They must slide silently past the house without waking their father. There was no sound except the little whir of the runners on the snow and the wind rushing past. Then, just as the sled was swooping towards the house, a big black pig stepped out of the woods. He walked into the middle of the road and stood there. The sled was going so fast it couldn't be stopped. There wasn't time to turn. The sled went right under the hog and picked him up. With a squeal, he sat down on James, and he kept on squealing long and loud and shrill. Squee! Squee! They flashed by the house, the pig sitting in front, then James, then George, then Grandpa, and they saw their father standing in the doorway looking at them. They couldn't stop. They couldn't hide. There was no time to say anything. Down the hill they went, the hog sitting on James and squealing all the way. At the bottom of the hill they stopped. The hog jumped off James and ran away into the woods, still squealing. The boys walked slowly and solemnly up the hill. They put the sled away. They sneaked into the house and slipped quietly to their places on the bench. Their father was reading his Bible. He looked up at them without saying a word. Then he went on reading, and they studied their catechism. But when the sun went down and the Sabbath day was over, their father took them out to the woodshed and tanned their jackets. First James, then George, then Grandpa. So you see, Laura and Mary, Pa said, you may find it hard to be good, but you should be glad that it isn't as hard to be good now as it was when Grandpa was a boy. Did little girls have to be as good as that? Laura asked, and Ma said, it was harder for little girls because they had to behave like little ladies all the time, not only on Sundays. Little girls could never slide downhill like boys. Little girls had to sit in the house and stitch on samplers. "Now run along and let Ma put you to bed," said Pa, and he took his fiddle out of its box. Laura and Mary lay in their trundle bed and listened to the Sunday hymns, for even the fiddle must not sing the weekday songs on Sundays. "Rock of Ages, cleft for me," Pa sang with the fiddle. Then he sang, "Shall I be carried to the skies on flowery beds of ease, while others fought to win the prize and sailed through bloody seas." Laura began to float away on the music, and then she heard a clattering noise, and there was Ma by the stove getting breakfast. It was Monday morning, and Sunday would not come again for a whole week. That morning, when Pa came in to breakfast, he caught Laura and said he must give her a spanking. First, he explained that today was her birthday, and she would not grow properly next year unless she had a spanking. And then he spanked so gently and carefully that it did not hurt a bit. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. He counted and spanked slowly. 1 spank for each year, and at last 1 big spank to grow on. Then Pa gave her a little wooden man he had whittled out of a stick to be company for Charlotte. Ma gave her 5 little cakes, 1 for each year that Laura had lived with her and Pa. And Mary gave her a new dress for Charlotte. Mary had made the dress herself when Laura thought she was sewing on her patchwork quilt. And that night, for a special birthday treat, Pa played Pop Goes the Weasel for her. He sat with Laura and Mary close against his knees while he played. "Now watch," he said. "Watch, and maybe you can see the weasel pop out this time." Then he sang, "A penny for a spool of thread, another for a needle, that's the way the money goes." Laura and Mary bent close, watching, for they knew now was the time. "Pop!" said Pa's finger on the string. "Goes the weasel," sang the fiddle, plain as plain. But Laura and Mary hadn't seen Pa's finger make the string pop. "Oh, please, please, do it again," they begged. Pa's blue eyes laughed, and the fiddle went on while he sang. "All around the cobbler's bench, the monkey chased the weasel, the preacher kissed the cobbler's wife, pop goes the weasel." They hadn't seen Pa's finger that time either. He was so quick they could never catch him, so they went laughing to bed and lay listening to Pa and the fiddle singing. There was an old darky, and his name was Uncle Ned, and he died long ago. There was no wool on the top of his head in the place where the wool ought to grow. His fingers were as long as the cane in the brake. His eyes they could hardly see, and he had no teeth to eat the hoe cake, so he had to let the hoe cake be. So hang up the shovel and the hoe, lay down the fiddle and the bow. There's no more work for old Uncle Ned, for he's gone where the good darkies go.
Chapter 6. 2 Big Bears. Then one day Pa said that spring was coming. In the big woods, the snow was beginning to thaw. Bits of it dropped from the branches of the trees and made little holes in the softening snowbanks below. At noon, all of the big icicles along the eaves of the little house quivered and sparkled in the sunshine. And drops of water hung trembling at their tips. Pa said he must go to town to trade the furs of the wild animals he had been trapping all winter. So one evening he made a big bundle of them. There were so many furs that when they were packed tightly and tied together, they made a bundle almost as big as Pa. Very early one morning, Pa strapped the bundle of furs on his shoulders and started to walk to town. There were so many furs to carry that he could not take his gun. Ma was worried, but Pa said that by starting before the sun up and walking very fast all day, he could get home again before dark. The nearest town was far away. Laura and Mary had never seen a town. They had never seen a store, and they had never even seen 2 houses standing together. But they knew that in a town there were many houses, and a store full of candy and calico and other wonderful things, powder and shot and salt and store sugar. They knew that Pa would trade his furs to the storekeeper for beautiful things from town, and all day they were expecting the presents he would bring them. When the sun sank low above the treetops,
and no more drops fell from the tips of the icicles, they began to watch eagerly for Pa. The sun sank out of sight, the woods grew dark, and he did not come. Ma started supper and set the table, but he did not come. It was time to do the chores, and still he had not come. Ma said that Laura might come with her while she milked the cow. Laura could carry the lantern. So Laura put on her coat, and Ma buttoned it up, and Laura put her hands into her red mittens that hung by a red yarn string around her neck, while Ma lighted the candle in the lantern. Laura was proud to be helping Ma with the milking, and she carried the lantern very carefully. Its sides were of tin, with places cut in them for the candlelight to shine through. When Laura walked behind Ma on the path to the barn, the little bits of candlelight from the lantern leaped out all around her on the snow. The night was not yet dark. The woods were dark, but there was a gray light on the snowy path, and in the sky there were a few faint stars. The stars did not look as warm and as bright as the little lights that came from the lantern. Laura was surprised to see the dark shape of Suki, the brown cow, standing at the barnyard gate. Ma was surprised too. It was too early in the spring for Suki to be let out in the big woods to eat grass. She lived in the barn, but sometimes on warm days Pa left the door of her stall open so she could come into the barnyard. Now Ma and Laura saw her behind the bars waiting for them. Ma went up to the gate and pushed against it to open it, but it did not open very far because there was Suki standing against it. Ma said, "Suki, get over!" She reached across the gate and slapped Suki's shoulder. Just then, one of the dancing little bits of light from the lantern jumped between the bars of the gate, and Laura saw long, shaggy black fur and two little glittering eyes. Suki had thin, short brown fur. Suki had large, gentle eyes. Ma said, "Laura, walk back to the house." So Laura turned around and began to walk toward the house. Guys, Ma came behind her. When they had gone part way, Ma snatched her up, lantern and all, and ran. Ma ran with her into the house and slammed the door. Then Laura said, "Ma, was it a bear?" "Yes, Laura," Ma said, "it was a bear." Laura began to cry. She hung on to Ma and sobbed, "Oh, will he eat Suki?" "No," Ma said, hugging her. "Suki is safe in the barn." "No," Ma said, hugging her. "Suki is safe in the barn. Think, Laura, all those big, heavy logs in the barn walls, and the door is heavy and solid, made to keep bears out. No, the bear cannot get in and eat Suki." Laura felt better then. "But he could have hurt us, couldn't he?" she asked. "He didn't hurt us," Ma said. "You were a good girl, Laura, to do exactly as I told you, and to do it quickly, without asking why." Ma was trembling, and she began to laugh a little. "To think," she said, "I've slapped a bear." Then she put supper on the table for Laura and Mary. Pa had not yet come. He didn't come. Laura and Mary were undressed, and they said their prayers and snuggled into the trundle bed. Ma sat by the lamp, mending one of Pa's shirts. The house seemed cold and still and strange without Pa. Laura listened to the wind in the big woods. All around the house, the wind went crying as though it were lost in the dark and the cold. The wind sounded frightened. Ma finished mending the shirt. Laura saw her fold it slowly and carefully. She smoothed it with her hand. Then she did a thing she had never done before. She went to the door and pulled the leather latch string through its hole in the door so that nobody could get in from outside unless she lifted the latch. She came and took Carrie, all limp and sleeping, out of the big bed. She saw that Laura and Mary were still awake, and she said to them, "Go to sleep, girls. Everything is all right. Pa will be here in the morning." Then she went back to her rocking chair and sat there rocking gently and holding baby Carrie in her arms. She was sitting up late waiting for Pa, and Laura and Mary meant to stay awake too, till he came, but at last they went to sleep. In the morning, Pa was there. He had brought candy for Laura and Mary and 2 pieces of pretty calico to make them each a dress. Mary's was china blue pattern on a white ground, and Laura's was dark red with little golden brown dots on it. Ma had calico for a dress too. It was brown with a big feathery white pattern all over it. They were all happy because Pa had got such good prices for his furs that he could afford to get them such beautiful presents. The tracks of the big bear were all around the barn, and there were marks of his claws on the walls, but Suki and the horses were safe inside. All that day the sun shone and the snow melted. Little streams of water ran from the icicles, which all the time grew thinner. Before the sun set that night, the bear tracks were only shapeless marks in the wet, soft snow. After supper, Pa took Laura and Mary on his knees, and he said he had a new story to tell them. The story of Pa and the Bear in the Way. When I went to town yesterday with the furs, I found it hard walking in the soft snow. It took me a long time to get to town, and other men with furs had come in earlier to do their trading. The storekeeper was busy, and I had to wait until he could look at my furs. Then we had to bargain about the price of each one, and then I had to pick out the things that I wanted to take in trade. So it was nearly sundown before I could start home. I tried to hurry, but the walking was hard and I was tired, so I had not gone far before night came, and I was alone in the big woods without my gun. There were still 6 miles to walk, and I came along as fast as I could. The night grew darker and darker, and I wished for my gun because I knew that some of the bears had come out of their winter dens. I had seen their tracks when I went to town in the morning. Bears are hungry and cross at this time of year, you know. They have been sleeping in their dens all winter long with nothing to eat, and that makes them thin and angry when they wake up. I did not want to meet one. I hurried along as quick as I could in the dark. By and by the stars gave a little light. It was still black as pitch where the woods were thick, but in the open places I could see dimly. I could see the snowy road ahead a little way, and I could see the dark woods standing all around me. I was glad when I came to an open place where the stars gave me this faint light. All the time I was watching as well as I could for bears. I was listening for the sounds they make when they go carelessly through the bushes. Then I came again into an open place, and there, right in the middle of the road, I saw a big black bear. He was standing up on his hind legs looking at me. I could see his eyes shine. I could see his pig snout, and I could even see one of his claws in the starlight. My scalp prickled and my hair stood straight up. I stopped in my tracks and stood still. The bear did not move. There he stood looking at me. I knew it would do no good to try to go around him. He would follow me into the dark woods where he could see better than I could. I did not want to fight a winter-starved bear in the dark. Oh, how I wished for my gun. I had to pass that bear to get home. I thought that if I could scare him, he might go out of the road and let me go by. So I took a deep breath, and suddenly I shouted with all my might and ran at him, waving my arms. He didn't move. I did not run very far toward him, I tell you. I stopped and looked at him, and he stood looking at me, and then I shouted again. There he stood. I kept on shouting and waving my arms, but he did not budge. Well, it would do me no good to run away. There were other bears in the woods. I might meet one at any time. I might as well deal with this one as with another. Besides, I was coming home to Ma and you girls. I would never get here if I ran away from everything in the woods that scared me. So at last I looked around and I got a good big club, a solid heavy branch that had been broken from a tree by the weight of the snow in the winter. I lifted it up in my hands and I ran straight at that bear. I swung my club as hard as I could and brought it down, bang, on his head. And there he still stood, for he was nothing but a big black burned stump. I had passed it on my way to town that morning. It wasn't a bear at all. I only thought it was. Because I had been thinking all the time about bears and being afraid I'd meet one. It really wasn't a bear at all? Mary asked. No, Mary, it wasn't a bear at all. There I'd been yelling and dancing and waving my arms all by myself in the big woods, trying to scare a stump. Laura said ours was really a bear, but we were not scared because we thought it was Suki. Pa did not say anything, but he hugged her tighter. Oh, that bear might have eaten Ma and me all up, Laura said, snuggling closer to him. But Ma walked right up to him and slapped him, and he didn't do anything at all. Why didn't he do anything? I guess he was too surprised to do anything, Laura, Pa said. I guess he was afraid when the lantern shone in his eyes, and when Ma walked up to him and slapped him, he knew she wasn't afraid. Well, you were brave too, Laura said. Even if it was only a stump, you thought it was a bear. You'd have hit him on the head with a club if he had been a bear, wouldn't you, Pa? Yes, said Pa, I would. You see, I had to. Then Ma said it was bedtime. She helped Laura and Mary undress and button up their red flannel nightgowns. They knelt down by the trundle bed and said their prayers. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Ma kissed them both and tucked the covers in around them. They lay there a while, looking at Ma's smooth parted hair and her hands busy with sewing in the lamplight. Her needle made little clicking sounds against her thimble, and then the thread went softly swish through the pretty calico that Pa had traded furs for. Laura looked at Pa, who was greasing his boots. His mustaches and his hair, with his long brown beard, were silky in the lamplight, and the colors of his plaid jacket were gay. He whistled cheerfully while he worked, and then he sang. The birds were singing in the morning, and the myrtle and the ivy were in bloom, and the sun o'er the hills was a-dawning. 'Twas then that I laid her in the tomb. It was a warm night. The fire had gone to coals on the earth, and Pa did not build it up. All around the little house in the big woods, there were little sounds of falling snow, and from the eaves there was the drip, drip of the melting icicles. It was just a little while. In just a little while, the trees would be putting off their baby leaves, all rosy and yellow and pale green, and there would be wildflowers and birds in the woods. Then there would be no more stories by the fire at night, but all day long Laura and Mary would run and play among the trees, for it would be spring.
Chapter 7. The Sugar Snow. For days the sun shone and the weather was warm. There was no frost on the windows in the mornings. All day the icicles fell one by one from the eaves with soft smashing and crackling sounds in the snowbanks beneath. The trees shook their wet, black branches, and chunks of snow fell down. When Mary and Laura pressed their noses against the cold window pane, they could see the drip of the water from the eaves and the bare branches of the trees. The snow did not glitter. It looked soft and tired. Under the trees it was pitted where the chunks of snow had fallen, and the banks beside the path were shrinking and settling. Then one day Laura saw a patch of bare ground in the yard. All day it grew bigger, and before the night the whole yard was bare mud. Only an icy path was left, and the snowbanks along the path of the fence and beside the woodpile. "Can't I go out to play, Ma?" Laura asked, and Ma said, "May, Laura." "May I go out to play?" she asked. "You may tomorrow," Ma promised. That night Laura woke up shivering. The bed covers felt thin, and her nose was icy cold. Ma was tucking another quilt over her. "Snuggle close to Mary," Ma said, "and you'll get warm." In the morning the house was warm from the stove, but when Laura looked out of the window she saw that the ground was covered with a soft, thick snow. All along the branches of the trees the snow was piled like feathers, and it lay in mounds along the top of the rail fence, and stood up in great white balls on top of the gate posts. Pa came in, shaking the soft snow from his shoulders and stamping it from his boots. It's a sugar snow," he said. Laura put her tongue quickly to a little bit of the white snow that lay in a fold on his sleeve. It was nothing but wet on her tongue, like any snow. She was glad that nobody had seen her taste it. "Why is it sugar snow, Pa?" she asked him. But he didn't have time to explain now. He must hurry away. He was going to Grandpa's. Grandpa lived far away in the big woods, where the trees were closer together and larger. Laura stood at the window and watched Pa, big and swift and strong, walking away over the snow. His gun was on his shoulder, his hatchet and powder horn